The crystal chandelier cast golden light across Le Bernardin's dining room when Marcus Blackwood's voice cut through the gentle murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. His manicured finger pointed directly at the trembling woman standing near the hostess station, her worn black dress a stark contrast to the elegant surroundings. "You don't belong here," he declared, his words dripping with contempt as every conversation died and every head turned toward the unfolding humiliation. The widow, Eleanor Mitchell, clutched her faded purse with white knuckles, her dignity crumbling under the weight of 200 stares. What Marcus would discover 3 months later about this woman's identity would not just shatter his world, but reveal a truth so devastating that it would haunt him for the rest of his days. Marcus Blackwood had constructed his empire with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a conqueror. 14 oil refineries across North America, technology investments that had transformed entire industries, real estate portfolios spanning from Manhattan penthouses to London office towers to Dubai luxury developments. At 42, his name appeared on Forbes lists and Bloomberg terminals. But more importantly, it appeared in the nightmares of competitors who had underestimated his capacity for calculated destruction. He had learned early that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. His corner office on the 57th floor of the Blackwood Tower was a testament to this philosophy. Chrome and glass surfaces that reflected light but revealed nothing, furniture chosen for intimidation rather than comfort, and windows that looked down on the city, like the eyes of a predator surveying its territory. Marcus commanded respect through fear, because he had discovered that fear was more reliable than admiration, more predictable than loyalty, and infinitely more profitable than kindness. The world existed in Marcus's mind as a simple hierarchy: those who possessed the intelligence, drive, and moral flexibility to claim power, and those who lacked these essential qualities and therefore deserved their lesser positions. He had built his fortune by identifying which category each person belonged to within the first 30 seconds of meeting them, then treating them accordingly. This evening's dinner at Le Bernardin was no exception. That particular evening at Le Bernardin represented more than just another business dinner. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to secure Marcus's next billion-dollar venture. His guests were 3 investors from the Emirates, men whose approval could unlock access to sovereign wealth funds that would dwarf even Marcus's considerable resources. Rashid Al-Mansouri, whose family controlled shipping lanes through the Persian Gulf. Ahmed bin Zayed, whose construction empire had built half of modern Dubai. And Khalil al-Rashid, whose influence with oil ministers could shift global energy markets with a single phone call. The restaurant hummed with the quiet energy of wealth-conducting business. Servers moved like ghosts between tables, laden with crystal and silver, their footsteps muffled by Persian carpets that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The air itself seemed rarefied, perfumed with expensive cologne, aged wine, and the intoxicating aroma of power being exercised without apology. Marcus had chosen this venue precisely because it represented everything he valued: exclusivity, perfection, and the clear demarcation between those who belonged and those who did not. The reservation list read like a directory of global influence, each name representing fortunes that could reshape nations. This was his world, his sanctuary, his perfectly controlled environment where every detail reinforced his position at the apex of human achievement. Then Eleanor Mitchell walked through the doors, and Marcus felt the delicate equilibrium of his evening begin to fracture. She moved with the careful steps of someone who knew she was entering foreign territory. 58 years old, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the elegant bone structure that time and grief had refined rather than eroded. Her black dress was clean and pressed but clearly dated, the fabric slightly worn at the sleeves, where her hands had worried the material during countless anxious moments. Her shoes, sensible and scuffed, spoke of a life lived on buses and sidewalks rather than in limousines and private jets. Eleanor approached the hostess station with the hesitant grace of someone who had once belonged in places like this, but now questioned her right to exist in them. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the refined accent of someone educated beyond her current circumstances. "Table for 2 under Mitchell," she said, her words barely audible above the restaurant's sophisticated murmur. "It was our anniversary tradition." The hostess, a young woman trained to identify social hierarchy within seconds, glanced toward Marcus's table, where his Arab guests were already expressing their disapproval through subtle shifts in posture and meaningful glances. The very presence of someone so obviously outside their economic sphere was disrupting the carefully maintained atmosphere of exclusivity that made Le Bernardin a temple of wealth rather than merely a restaurant. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he observed the scene unfolding. This woman, with her obvious struggle and modest appearance, was threatening to undermine months of careful cultivation. His guests had not become billionaires by tolerating disorder or accepting the presence of those who reminded them that poverty existed beyond their gilded circles. Marcus rose from his seat with deliberate slowness, his 6'3" frame unfolding like a predator emerging from concealment. The Italian wool of his suit caught the light as he moved, every line of his clothing speaking of money spent without consideration of cost. His handmade Oxford shoes clicked against the marble floor with the rhythm of approaching judgment as he crossed the dining room toward Eleanor. The conversation at his table had stopped completely. Rashid Al-Mansouri leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes following Marcus's movement, with the calculating interest of a man who understood that business was often conducted through displays of dominance. Ahmed bin Zayed's expression had hardened into the mask of someone who viewed poverty as a personal failing, a choice made by the weak. Khalil al-Rashid simply watched, his silence more eloquent than any words could be. Throughout the restaurant, other diners began to sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter, glances more frequent, as the elegant crowd prepared to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. The servers slowed their movements, their professional instincts telling them to become invisible, during moments when their wealthy clients chose to exercise their power. "Excuse me," Marcus said as he approached Eleanor, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that had silenced boardrooms and broken competitors. The words carried clearly in the suddenly quiet space, ensuring that his handling of this situation would be witnessed by everyone who mattered. "I think there's been a mistake." Eleanor looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with the confusion of someone who had not yet realized she was about to become the evening's entertainment. The reservation confirmation trembled in her weathered hands as she held it up like a shield against the approaching storm. "I have a reservation," she said quietly, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had been educated in better times. "My husband. He made it before he—" Her voice broke, the words catching in her throat as grief overwhelmed her ability to speak. Marcus felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes upon him, the pressure of his guests' expectations, the need to demonstrate the kind of decisive action that separated leaders from followers. In that moment he made a choice that would define the rest of his life, though he could not have known it then. "This establishment caters to a certain clientele," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the dining room with crystalline clarity. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere, more appropriate to your circumstances." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and embarrassment that spread throughout the restaurant. Eleanor's face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks as the full impact of his words struck her. Around them, other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away in shame, others watching with the morbid fascination of those witnessing a public execution. The hostess stammered an apology, her professional training warring with her basic human decency, but Marcus had already committed to his course of action. "Security will escort you out if necessary," he continued, each word carefully chosen to maximize the humiliation while maintaining a veneer of civilized discourse. "This is a place of business, not a charity." The cruelty in his voice was precise, surgical in its application, designed to cut deep while appearing reasonable to those who mattered. Eleanor's bottom lip trembled as she absorbed the magnitude of what was happening to her, but instead of collapsing under the weight of his attack, she straightened her shoulders with a dignity that should have moved even the coldest heart. Her hands stopped shaking as she folded the reservation confirmation and placed it carefully in her purse. When she looked at Marcus again, her eyes held something beyond hurt, beyond anger, beyond even disappointment. They held recognition. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to form. "I'm sorry for the disturbance." She turned toward the exit with her head held high, her footsteps steady despite the whispers that followed her like a storm. The sound of her dignity in retreat was perhaps the most damning thing about the entire scene. Marcus returned to his table feeling the satisfying weight of a crisis successfully managed. The approving nods from his Arab guests confirmed that he had handled the situation with exactly the kind of decisive authority they expected from potential partners. Rashid al-Mansouri lifted his wine glass in a subtle toast, his dark eyes gleaming with appreciation for Marcus's willingness to maintain standards. "Excellent judgment," he said quietly. "Too many Western businessmen have lost their understanding of proper social boundaries." Ahmed bin Zayed chuckled, a sound like expensive machinery running smoothly. "In Dubai, we appreciate those who understand that charity and business must remain separate enterprises. Sentiment is the enemy of profit." His words carried the weight of a man who had built skyscrapers while entire neighborhoods of workers lived in conditions he preferred not to acknowledge. The conversation resumed its previous flow, lubricated by aged whiskey and the shared satisfaction of a social hierarchy properly maintained. Orders were placed for dishes that cost more than most people spent on food in a month. Contracts were discussed with the casual ease of men who measured wealth in geological terms, thinking not in years, but in decades and generations. Yet something lingered in the air around their table, an uncomfortable residue that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the way some of the other diners glanced in their direction, with expressions that seemed less than admiring. Perhaps it was the subtle change in the servers' demeanor, their professional smiles becoming more mechanical, their movements more efficient but less warm. Or perhaps it was the memory of Eleanor's eyes in that final moment, the way she had looked at him with something beyond hurt or anger. There had been something in her gaze that suggested she knew him, really knew him, in a way that made his casual cruelty seem not just wrong, but personally devastating. Marcus dismissed these thoughts as the inevitable aftermath of necessary but unpleasant decisions. Leadership, he reminded himself, required the willingness to make choices that others might find distasteful. The weak allowed their emotions to cloud their judgment. The strong did what needed to be done regardless of how it felt. Outside Le Bernardin, Eleanor Mitchell walked into the cold December night with tears streaming down her face, each step taking her further from the warmth and light that represented a world she had once believed she might still belong to. The 23-degree wind cut through her thin coat like a knife, but the physical cold was nothing compared to the ice that had settled around her heart. She had recognized Marcus Blackwood the moment she saw him, though 4 decades had passed since their last meeting. The scared 8-year-old boy with leukemia had grown into a man whose wealth commanded global attention. But in that moment of cruelty, she had seen something that made her soul ache with a grief deeper than her husband's death. The boy she had loved, the child who had promised her he would use his life to help others the way she had helped him, had disappeared so completely that not even a trace remained in the man who had just destroyed her dignity for sport. 3 months dissolved into the relentless machinery of Marcus's business empire like sugar into acid. Quarterly reports revealed record profits across all sectors. The Dubai deal had closed with terms even more favorable than Marcus had dared to hope, opening doors to investment opportunities that would define the next decade of global energy markets. His name appeared on magazine covers, his opinions moved stock prices, and his endorsement could transform entire industries overnight. Yet for all his outward success, Marcus found himself occasionally troubled by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking, vague impressions of small hands and gentle voices that faded like smoke the moment consciousness returned. He dismissed these nocturnal disturbances as the inevitable cost of operating at the highest levels of international business, stress manifesting in subconscious symbols his mind couldn't properly process. The call that would shatter his carefully constructed reality came on a Tuesday morning, while Marcus reviewed acquisition targets from his corner office. The Manhattan skyline stretched before him through floor-to-ceiling windows, each building representing fortunes won and lost in the endless game of capital and ambition. His assistant's voice carried an unusual hesitation when she announced the unexpected visitor. "Sir, there's a young woman here to see you. She says it's about Eleanor Mitchell." The name hit him like a physical force, bringing with it the sudden clarity of suppressed memory. Eleanor Mitchell, the woman from Le Bernardin, the widow he had humiliated in front of 200 witnesses. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he remembered her face, the way her dignity had somehow remained intact, even as he systematically destroyed it. "I don't have time for whatever this is about," he said, his voice carrying less conviction than he intended. "Tell her to make an appointment through proper channels. She says she's Eleanor's daughter, sir, and that you need to hear what she has to say about her mother's will." The word will cut through Marcus's psychological defenses like a blade through paper. In his world, wills meant legal complications, inheritance disputes, potential litigation that could damage his carefully maintained reputation. He had learned long ago to pay immediate attention whenever legal documents were mentioned by strangers who appeared without warning at his private office. "Send her in," he said, curiosity and concern warring in his voice. "But make it clear that I have exactly 10 minutes. Sarah Mitchell entered his office with the same quiet dignity that had defined her mother's final moments at Le Bernardin. 28 years old, she moved with the careful composure of someone who had learned early that the world did not automatically grant respect to those who needed it most. Her grey suit was professional but inexpensive, her dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see too much. She sat across from Marcus's imposing mahogany desk without waiting for an invitation, her posture straight but not rigid, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Everything about her suggested someone who had inherited her mother's grace under pressure, refined by years of watching Eleanor navigate a world that had become progressively more hostile to people like them. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the educated tones of someone who had been raised with expectations that reality had not fulfilled. "My mother died last week." The words fell into the space between them, like stones dropped into deep water, creating ripples that seemed to disturb the very air. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, an emotion he couldn't immediately identify or control. Death, even the death of strangers, had always made him uncomfortable because it represented the one force even his wealth could not influence or negotiate with. Marcus felt a practiced condolence forming on his lips, the kind of empty sympathy he had perfected through decades of necessary but meaningless social interactions. But something in Sarah's direct gaze stopped the automatic response before it could emerge. Her eyes held the same unsettling quality he had noticed in Eleanor's final look, as if she possessed knowledge that rendered his usual social armor completely useless. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "But I'm not sure why you're here." Sarah reached into her leather bag with deliberate slowness, her movements suggesting someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. She withdrew a manila envelope, worn at the edges but still containing something that made her handle it with extreme care. "Because before she died, she left specific instructions about you, about what happened that night at the restaurant, about who you really are." The phrase "who you really are" hit Marcus like a physical blow. Throughout his adult life, his identity had been constructed around wealth, power, and the ability to control outcomes through the strategic application of both. The idea that a dying woman he barely remembered might possess insights into his true nature was deeply unsettling. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction that had intimidated boardrooms across 3 continents. Sarah's expression softened slightly, as if she recognized his confusion as genuine rather than defensive. "3 months ago, you humiliated my mother in front of a room full of people," she said, her voice steady but weighted with controlled emotion. "You called her a charity case. You suggested she didn't belong in civilized society. You had her escorted out of a restaurant where she had every legal and moral right to be." The memory rushed back in vivid, uncomfortable detail. Marcus remembered the satisfaction he had felt, the approval of his Arab investors, the sense of successfully maintaining the social order that protected his interests. He also remembered with growing discomfort the look in Eleanor's eyes as she had turned to leave. "Your mother was dressed inappropriately for the establishment," he said, falling back on the justification that had seemed so reasonable 3 months earlier. "I was protecting the restaurant's reputation and my guests' comfort." Sarah's laugh contained no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who had heard similar excuses before. "My mother was wearing the only dress she owned that was suitable for a nice dinner. The same dress she wore to my father's funeral 6 months earlier. The same dress she had worn to every important occasion for the past 5 years, because his medical bills had consumed everything they had saved for retirement. Each word landed like a small explosion in Marcus's consciousness. He began to understand that what he had interpreted as inappropriate dress was actually the careful presentation of someone making the best of severely limited resources. Eleanor had not chosen to dress modestly. She had dressed as well as her circumstances permitted. She was trying to honor their 25th wedding anniversary, Sarah continued, even though he was gone. That reservation represented the last connection she had to the life they had built together. It was the final promise he had made to her before the cancer took his ability to speak. Marcus felt something cold and uncomfortable settling in his stomach. The casual cruelty he had dispensed 3 months earlier was beginning to reveal itself as something far more damaging than he had realized. He had not simply embarrassed a stranger, he had desecrated a sacred ritual, destroyed a widow's final link to her dead husband's love. "I couldn't have known that," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No, you couldn't," Sarah agreed, "but you could have shown basic human decency. You could have asked questions before you passed judgment. You could have remembered that every person carries a story you know nothing about." Her voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the pain in her eyes, the grief that his actions had compounded. "Instead, you chose to demonstrate your power by destroying someone who had no ability to fight back. You chose to humiliate a woman who was already carrying more loss than most people experience in a lifetime." She opened the manila envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. Its pages yellowed with age and handling. "This is what my mother wrote about you, Mr. Blackwood." Every night for 3 months she wrote about that evening, about how it made her feel, about what it taught her about human nature, about what it revealed concerning the person you had become. Marcus found himself leaning forward despite his discomfort. Why would she write about a stranger? "Because you weren't a stranger to her," Sarah said quietly. "She knew exactly who you were." The revelation hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Marcus's mouth went dry. "That's impossible." Sarah placed a photograph on the desk, black and white, slightly faded. It showed a young woman in a nurse's uniform standing beside a hospital bed. In the bed lay a small boy, maybe 8 years old, his face pale but smiling. "St. Mary's Children's Hospital, 1982, she said. "That little boy is you, Mr. Blackwood." The world tilted. Marcus grabbed the edge of his desk, his vision blurring as memories flooded back. The endless hospital stays, the experimental treatments, the fear that lived in his parents' eyes. And through it all, a nurse with gentle hands and a kind voice who made the pain bearable. "Eleanor," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer he had forgotten he knew. "Eleanor Thompson. Before she married my father," Sarah confirmed. "She was your night nurse for 8 months while you battled leukemia. She held your hand during the worst treatments. She sang to you when you couldn't sleep. She celebrated with your family when you went into remission." Marcus stared at the photograph, his hands trembling as he traced the outline of the woman who had saved his life not with medicine, but with compassion. The same woman he had destroyed in a moment of casual cruelty 40 years later. "She recognized you immediately that night," Sarah continued, her voice softer now, tinged with the pain of loss. "Even though you had grown up, even though you looked nothing like that scared little boy. She never forgot a patient, especially not the ones who touched her heart." The office felt like it was closing in around him. Marcus thought about Eleanor's face that night, the way she had looked at him with something beyond hurt. It hadn't been surprise or anger, it had been heartbreak. The look of someone watching a child she had loved grow into something unrecognizable. "Why didn't she say anything?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because she hoped you would remember her on your own," Sarah said. "She hoped that somewhere inside the man you had become, there was still a trace of the boy she had cared for, the boy who used to tell her he wanted to grow up to help people the way she helped him." Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of his forgotten promises. As a child, weak and frightened, he had sworn to Eleanor that when he got better, when he grew strong, he would use his life to make the world kinder. He would be like her, a light in dark places. "She never stopped believing in that boy," Sarah said, "even after what you did to her. Even when she came home crying that night, asking herself how someone she had loved could become so cold." The tears came without warning, sliding down Marcus's face as decades of buried memories surfaced. Eleanor reading him stories during chemotherapy. Eleanor bringing him extra pudding when he couldn't eat anything else. Eleanor promising him that being sick didn't make him weak. that kindness would always be the strongest thing he could choose. I became everything she would have hated, he said, his voice breaking. No, Sarah said firmly. You became someone who forgot who they used to be. There's a difference. She reached into the envelope again and pulled out another document. This is why I'm here, Mr. Blackwood. This is what she wanted you to know. The paper was a legal document, formal and typed, but with handwritten notes in the margins in Eleanor's careful script. Marcus read the heading with growing confusion. Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Mitchell. I don't understand, he said. My mother didn't have much, Sarah explained. The house was mortgaged. The medical bills from Dad's cancer ate through their savings. But she did have one thing of value, a small trust fund her grandmother left her, about $50,000. Money she had been saving for my wedding someday. Marcus looked up from the document, afraid to hope he understood where this was leading. She left it to you, Sarah said simply. The words hit him like a physical force. That's impossible, after what I did to her. Especially because of what you did to her, Sarah corrected. She said in her letter that you had clearly lost your way, that the man who humiliated her wasn't the boy she had loved, and that maybe if you knew who you used to be, you might remember how to be that person again. Marcus read through Eleanor's will with shaking hands. The legal language was clear, but the handwritten note in the margin was what destroyed him. For Marcus, who once promised to make the world kinder, I'm still waiting for you to keep that promise. Love always, Eleanor. She forgave me, he whispered in disbelief. More than that, Sarah said. She never stopped believing you could change. Even on her deathbed, she talked about the little boy who used to cry because his treatments hurt other children too, who asked if there was a way to make medicine that didn't hurt, who wanted to grow up and fix everything that was broken. Marcus set the document down carefully, his whole body shaking with the enormity of what he had lost and found. What am I supposed to do with this? Whatever she hoped you would do, Sarah said, standing up. The money comes with only one condition. You have to read her letters first. All 93 of them. She wrote one every night after you humiliated her, working through her feelings, trying to understand how to forgive you. She placed a thick manila folder on his desk. They're all here. Her thoughts, her memories of taking care of you, her disappointment in what you became, and ultimately, her hope for what you could still be. Marcus stared at the folder like it might explode. Why are you doing this? Why bring this to me? You could have just kept the money. Because she asked me to, Sarah said simply. And because I think she was right. I think somewhere inside you is still the boy she loved, the boy who wanted to help people. She paused at the door, looking back at him with eyes that held both challenge and compassion. My mother spent her last 3 months writing those letters, instead of enjoying what little time she had left. The least you can do is read them. After Sarah left, Marcus sat alone in his office for hours, staring at the folder. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy, but inside his perfect corporate sanctuary, time seemed suspended. He thought about Eleanor's hands, how gentle they had been when he was afraid. He thought about her voice, singing softly during the endless nights when pain made sleep impossible. Finally, as the sun began to set, he opened the first letter. Dear Marcus, it began in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Today you broke my heart, not because of what you said, but because I realized you don't remember who you used to be. The letter described that night from her perspective, how she had recognized him immediately, how her heart had raced with joy at seeing the little boy she had loved grown into a successful man, how that joy had turned to crushing disappointment as he spoke to her with such cruelty. I held you when you were afraid, she wrote. I sang to you when nightmares came. I promised you that kindness would always be your strength. Where did that boy go, Marcus? What happened to the child who cried for other sick children? Marcus read letter after letter, each one a window into Eleanor's heart as she processed her hurt and worked toward forgiveness. She wrote about his childhood, about the dreams he had shared with her during long hospital nights. She wrote about her own struggles after his cruelty, how she had questioned her faith in human goodness. But as the letters progressed, they became something else. They became a roadmap back to the person he used to be. I realized today, she wrote in letter 47, that anger toward you only hurts me. You are lost, but not beyond finding. I choose to remember the boy who wanted to heal the world. Letter 62 described a dream she had, where Marcus was 8 years old again, asking her to help him understand why people were mean to each other. In the dream, I told you that sometimes people forget they were once children too. Sometimes they need someone to remind them. The final letter, dated just 3 days before her death, was the shortest and most devastating. Dear Marcus, I am dying now, but I am not sad. I got to love you when you needed it most, and that love was real even if you don't remember it. I pray someday you will find your way back to the boy who wanted to make everything better. The world needs that boy. It always has. With all my love, Eleanor. Marcus read the last letter 3 times before the tears made it impossible to continue. He sat in his darkened office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, and felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or loneliness. He felt hollow, carved out by the realization of what he had become and what he had lost. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He walked into his assistant's office and cleared his entire schedule. "Cancel everything," he said. "I need to take care of something important." He drove to Eleanor's neighborhood, the same area where he had stuck posters looking for Lucas in the previous story's echo. But this was different. This was about finding something he had lost in himself. The houses were modest here, working class with small yards and children's toys scattered on porches. Eleanor's house was easy to find. Sarah had given him the address, perhaps knowing he would need to see where Eleanor had spent her final months. It was a small blue house with white trim, a garden full of flowers that were still blooming despite their caretaker's absence. Sarah answered the door wearing paint-splattered clothes, her hair tied back as she worked on packing her mother's belongings. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "Did you read them?" "Everyone," Marcus said, his voice hoarse from crying. "I remember her now. I remember everything." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then stepped aside to let him in. She hoped you would. The inside of Eleanor's house was like walking into a memory. Simple furniture, well-maintained but clearly old. Family photos covering every surface. And there on the mantelpiece was a photo that made Marcus's breath catch. It was him at age 8, smiling in a hospital bed, with Eleanor beside him. She had kept his picture for 34 years. "She never forgot any of her patients," Sarah said, following his gaze. "But she always said you were special. She said you had an old soul, that you understood suffering in a way most children couldn't." Marcus approached the photo with trembling hands. "I promised her I would change the world," he whispered. "I promised her I would help people." "It's not too late," Sarah said quietly. That afternoon, Marcus asked Sarah to show him Eleanor's medical bills from her final illness. The stack of papers told a story of financial devastation, treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, medications that cost more than most people's monthly salary, specialists who demanded payment up front. "She sold her car to pay for the last round of chemotherapy," Sarah explained. "Took 3 buses to get to treatments. Never complained, never asked for help." Marcus thought about his own medical bills from childhood, how his father's insurance and wealth had made his treatment possible. Eleanor had saved his life with her care, but she had died struggling to afford the same kind of help. "The $50,000, he said suddenly. "I can't take it." "You have to," Sarah replied firmly. It was her wish. "Then I'll take it," Marcus said, "and I'll make it into something she would be proud of." Over the next 6 months, Marcus transformed not just Eleanor's gift, but his entire life. He liquidated assets, sold properties, and dissolved investments that were built on questionable foundations. He faced the shocked disapproval of his business associates, the accusations that he had lost his mind, the threats from those who profited from his previous ruthlessness. But for the first time in decades, Marcus slept peacefully at night. Eleanor's $50,000 became the seed for something unprecedented, the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to providing free medical care and support for families facing catastrophic illness. Marcus didn't just donate money. He donated his expertise, his connections, his relentless drive that had built his empire. Within a year, the foundation had raised $12 million. Medical debt forgiveness programs, experimental treatment funding, support groups for families navigating the healthcare system. Marcus worked 18-hour days not to build wealth, but to fulfill a promise he had made to a dying nurse 40 years earlier. Sarah became the foundation's first employee, leaving her teaching job to coordinate outreach programs. On the first anniversary of Eleanor's death, she found Marcus in the Foundation's office at midnight, reviewing applications from families who needed help. She would be proud, Sarah said, setting a cup of coffee beside him. Marcus looked up from the stack of letters from desperate parents, their words echoing his own mother's prayers from decades ago. "I hope so," he said. "I have a lot to make up for." The Foundation helped 300 families this year, Sarah pointed out. 300 children got treatment they couldn't afford. That's what she would care about. Marcus nodded, then opened the desk drawer where he kept Eleanor's photo from the hospital. "I talk to her sometimes," he admitted. "Tell her about the kids we're helping. Ask her what she thinks about difficult cases." "What does she tell you?" "To remember what it felt like to be afraid," Marcus said. "To remember that every patient is somebody's child. To remember that kindness is the only thing that really heals people." The Foundation grew, expanding beyond medical aid to address the systemic issues that created Eleanor's struggles. Housing assistance for families during treatment, scholarship programs for children who had missed school due to illness, support networks for healthcare workers facing burnout and moral distress. Marcus testified before Congress about healthcare reform, his voice steady, as he told Eleanor's story to rooms full of politicians who had never faced choosing between medicine and rent. He funded research into treatments that prioritized patient dignity alongside medical efficacy. But perhaps most importantly, he changed how he moved through the world. The man who had once humiliated a grieving widow now stopped to help strangers, listened to stories from people others might dismiss, and treated service workers with the same respect he showed to billionaires. 3 years after Eleanor's death, Marcus received a letter that changed everything once again. It was from a young doctor named David Reeves, working at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. "Dear Mr. Blackwood," the letter began, "I am writing to thank you for the Eleanor Mitchell Fellowship that funded my pediatric oncology training. Today I had the privilege of caring for a little girl who reminded me of the patients Nurse Mitchell wrote about in her journals." Marcus had donated Eleanor's professional journals to the hospital's nursing education program, hoping her wisdom could train new generations of caregivers. "This little girl was scared and alone," Dr. Reeves continued. "Her family couldn't afford to stay with her during treatment. I remembered something Nurse Mitchell wrote about a patient from the 1980s, a boy who taught her that sometimes the best medicine is simply being seen, being valued, being loved." The letter went on to describe how Dr. Reeves had arranged for the girl's grandmother to stay at the hospital, how he had advocated for additional pain management, how he had read stories to her during chemotherapy, just as Eleanor had done decades earlier. "I realized I was treating her the way Nurse Mitchell taught us to treat you," he wrote, "with the understanding that healing happens when we remember that every patient is carrying someone's whole world in their body." Marcus read the letter 3 times before calling Sarah. "We need to expand the fellowship program," he said without preamble. "There are more doctors who need to learn Eleanor's approach." "How many more?" Sarah asked, familiar with his sudden inspirations. "All of them," Marcus said. "Every medical student, every resident, every practicing physician who forgot why they became healers in the first place." The Eleanor Mitchell Institute for Compassionate Medicine opened its doors on a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after Eleanor's death. The building itself told a story of transformation that would have delighted her. The former site of Marcus's most exclusive private dining club had been rebuilt as a training center where medical professionals from around the world came to learn that healing required more than technical expertise. The irony was intentional and profound. Where Marcus had once excluded people based on their economic status, medical students now learn to include every patient in their circle of compassionate care. Where conversations had once revolved around profit margins, discussions now focused on reducing human suffering and preserving dignity during vulnerable moments. The Institute's curriculum was built around Eleanor's journals and patient care notes, which Marcus had donated, to create a comprehensive archive of compassionate nursing practices. Students spent their first week reading Eleanor's reflections on 40 years of patient care, learning to see illness through the eyes of someone who had never forgotten that medicine was fundamentally about human connection. The Foundation's medical assistance programs had grown beyond Marcus's projections. What had begun with Eleanor's $50,000 bequest now disbursed over $30 million annually to families facing catastrophic medical expenses. More importantly, the foundation had changed how healthcare organizations approached financial distress among patients. Sarah Mitchell Blackwood, who had legally changed her name after Marcus adopted her, now directed a network of patient advocates embedded in hospitals across North America. These advocates were trained not just to navigate insurance bureaucracies, but to preserve patient dignity during the most dehumanizing aspects of serious illness. The transformation in Marcus himself had been perhaps the most dramatic change of all. Colleagues who remembered his previous ruthlessness struggled to reconcile that man with the person who now spent 18-hour days advocating for healthcare reform that would benefit people he would never meet. His business empire had been systematically restructured around principles that Eleanor would have recognized. Companies that couldn't demonstrate genuine benefit to human welfare were sold or dissolved. Investments that generated profit through exploitation were liquidated regardless of their financial performance. But perhaps the most profound change was in how Marcus experienced ordinary human interactions. The man who had once categorized people as useful or disposable now approached every encounter with genuine curiosity about the stories others carried. On the 5th anniversary of Eleanor's death, Marcus stood at her graveside with Sarah and nearly 300 people whose lives had been directly changed by the Foundation and Institute. The gathering included doctors who had learned to practice medicine with greater compassion, families who had received life-saving care they couldn't afford, and researchers whose work was funded by Eleanor's ongoing legacy. She always said the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you left behind, Sarah said, as they gathered around the simple granite headstone that bore Eleanor's name and a single line: "She loved strangers as family." Marcus placed a bouquet of white roses on Eleanor's grave, the same type she had brought him during his darkest days as a hospitalized child. The gesture completed a circle that had taken 40 years to close, connecting the scared boy who had promised to help others with the man who had finally learned how to keep that promise. "Thank you," he whispered, kneeling beside the headstone. "Thank you for never giving up on the boy who wanted to change the world. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become who you promised to be." Walking back to the car with Sarah, Marcus reflected on the profound truth that had taken him so long to understand. Eleanor's greatest gift had not been her nursing skills, though they had been extraordinary. Her greatest gift had been her unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption, her faith that love could resurrect itself even in the coldest heart. The Foundation and Institute would continue their work long after Marcus was gone, but their true legacy would be measured in moments of connection between caregivers and patients, in the preservation of dignity during vulnerability, in the recognition that healing and humanity were inseparably linked. Eleanor Mitchell had been right about everything. Love never stopped believing in the possibility of becoming better. Kindness was indeed the strongest force in the universe, and it was never too late to remember who you promised to be. If this story moved you, consider the Eleanor Mitchells working quietly around us every day, caring for others without recognition or reward. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories that remind us why compassion matters, especially in a world that often rewards cruelty. Like this video if it helped you remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Ring that notification bell because sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we're tempted to dismiss or overlook. Until next time, remember that the boy or girl who once believed in changing the world is still alive inside you, waiting for permission to try again.